Okay, good afternoon and welcome. Good afternoon and welcome to everyone to this plenary in a series of really impressive and important discussions that have been taking place as part of this conference. And we have a very interesting topic and very distinguished panelists, and I'll get to them in a minute. But before we do that, I'd like to just turn over to Shireen Ghunaib for a moment to give us some housekeeping rules and advice on how to make sure that we use this time most effectively. So, Shireen, thank you very much for organizing this, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon. It's lovely to see a lot of friends coming on board for the session, and we have a very distinguished panel this afternoon. I've got 3 announcements to make. One, for those of you who would wish to follow the session in Arabic, there's Arabic translation available. There's an interpretation button on the right-hand side that you can press on. Unfortunately, Zoom does not allow for Arabic as a choice, so we're having to use Spanish. So if you wish to follow the proceedings in Arabic, you need to press on the Spanish. If you wish to follow the proceedings purely in English, you press on English. And if you wish to stay as we are, you just follow it as we are. That's the first announcement. The second announcement has to do with the questions and answers for the session. If you wish at any point in time to put a question forward to any of the panelists, please do so through the Q&A button at the bottom there. That would allow us to table the questions, to take them in turn as we open the floor for the Q&A. Or alternatively, if you wish to take the floor in person, please do raise your hand. And Dr. Masood will be flagging the names, and we will be availing the floor accordingly. And finally, I just want to bring your attention that the session is being recorded and shown live on the ERF official YouTube channel. And with that, I turn the floor back to Dr. Masood.
Thank you very much, Shireen. Thank you for those pieces of information. So now we get into our topic, and today we're going to be talking about the political economy challenges to diversification strategies, and actually political economy challenges more broadly to economic reform. And all the panelists on this session have a lot of experience both in studying these issues, but also in trying to apply some of the lessons that they and others have brought in trying to follow through on economic reform. And it's really my pleasure to welcome them to this. So the way we're going to structure this is that we are first going to turn to all of our panelists in turn to set out their initial thoughts. And then I'm hoping that we will have enough time to have a real conversation, both amongst the panelists and also with all of you who are participating in this at the moment, listening to the discussion. You've seen who they are, but let me very quickly just remind you the order in which we are going to proceed. We're going to start with Dr. Ishac Diwan, who is now at Paris Sciences et Lettres, also associated with ERF, and he will give us a little bit of an historical overview, comparing the current situation with going back one generation at least, looking at the 1990s and then trying to see how the situation today compares with that. Then we're going to take 3 regional, sub-regional perspectives of this. So we're going to go next to Dr. Mustapha Nabli. Mustapha, of course, now the North Africa Bureau of Economic Studies, but has had many roles in policymaking, including as governor of the central bank in Tunisia, but where he was applying a lot of this right in the middle of a reform process in that country. He's going to talk to us a bit about the Maghreb. And then we go to Dr. Omar Azaz. Omar, of course, very distinguished, the former Prime Minister of Jordan, will talk to us a bit, take us from the Maghreb over to the Mashriq, give us a sense of what is going on and how the issues stack up in Jordan and Lebanon. And then finally, we're going to come to Dr. Khabani Nader. Khabani Nader is with the Brookings Doha Center, and of course, he has an opportunity to really observe the economies of the Gulf, very different from the other economies that we will have been talking about, the Maghreb or in the case of Jordan and Lebanon. So we really look forward, and the political economy you'll find in the conversation is a little bit peculiar in each of these different situations, different contexts, but there are also some common threads. So that's the plan. And without further ado, Ishac, if I could turn to you, please, first to set the stage, and then you have about 15 minutes, and then we will go to Mustapha after that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Masood. Well, I'm really honored to be with such distinguished panelists, but also I regret that this is virtual. We all miss, I'm sure, our annual meetings where we used to mingle at these ERF occasions. In any case, my task today really is to frame the macro situation and the challenges going forward, and very much so in comparison with the situation of the 80s, which, as you recall, had led to a lost decade, followed by some reform in the 90s, the structural adjustment period. So I'll do that in three parts. First, I'll describe this challenging situation. Then I'll do a comparison then and now to see what we can learn from the previous experience to the current challenges. And then I'll describe the trends that I see in the way various countries are approaching these challenges. So starting with the first point, really in this past decade, since the Arab Spring, at least since 2011, growth has been very disappointing in many MENA countries. And in view of the large size of fiscal and external deficits that have been accumulating, the growth of public debt, financial crises are looming for many countries at the same time where the street is really boiling in many places. And the COVID-19 shock in 2020 and what we'll inherit in 2021 has made all these economic and social challenges much worse. So in this really difficult situation, imagine that you're the head of a government in the region. There are really three things that you may consider doing. First thing is you may want to reduce deficits, implement austerity. If you don't, for many countries, you're going into the wall, into a financial crisis in the short or medium term. That's one. Number two, you may engage in structural reforms in order to boost growth, which is very weak now. For example, open up for the private sector. And if you don't do that, you face lower growth in the medium and longer term. The current situation of low growth will continue. The third thing that you may consider, given the situation, is to satisfy protesters with political, economic, or social concessions. And in many countries, if you don't do that, you would have to increase repression. So if you think about these three choices together, they amount to many hard dilemmas. We can call this triangle a trilemma, really, because efforts to improve in any one of those dimensions will actually make the other dimensions harder. And that's the predicament of today for many policymakers. So if I take those one by one, reducing the fiscal deficit rapidly to avoid a debt crisis is likely to reduce growth, increase unemployment, and possibly make structural adjustment harder. It will also inflame the street, pushing regimes to respond to current protests with more repression rather than opening up. Now, If you look at the second point, if you engage in structural reforms, say requiring more competitive pressure, fairer access to finance, that will be opposed by many of those that would lose, whether it's unions, civil servants, or those privileged firms of the past, which is likely to increase political instability and make the political opening harder, but will also create fiscal pressure in the short term, creative destruction, financing to compensate losers, for example. And finally, the political opening doesn't resolve all the problems, as we've seen in Tunisia. It creates its own challenges. The regime change, as in Tunisia or in Sudan now, can lead to a period of instability where political forces fight to fill the political vacuum rather than deliver the public goods. And this is unlike Latin America in the 80s, where actually countries liberalized both their economy and their polity. But we have to keep in mind that they had long democratic traditions. So really, to conclude this first part, this trilemma in which we are is difficult. It's hard to achieve the three goals at the same time. At best, you would achieve two, and even that is not easy. So how do we think of how policymakers approach these difficult challenges? Now, can we learn from the 80s? So that's my second point. There are many similarities really between the 80s and the 20s today. Growth was low and is low. And actually, if you look at growth in the region in the past 10 years, it's between 0 and 1% on a per capita on average, which is very close to the 80s in the region. Debts are high, and they were high. That grew then in order to delay reform, and the same has happened in the past 10 years. The economy is in a state of sclerosis. There were semi-bankrupt SOEs in the past that were lowering growth, and now we have large politically connected firms that rose in the past that have been weakened by many things, including political change. In the 70s, we had food riots, if you recall. Now we have the Arab Spring, and so the street is mobilized and unpredictable. And the regional situation, the geopolitics, were also difficult then. Remember Palestine, Iran, Iraq, and now we have tensions between the three big economies of the region: Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. So what happened then in the 80s? The trilemma was really solved mostly by focusing on one, fiscal adjustment, with very little, if anything, on structural change and on political change. Countries adjusted slowly on the fiscal, on one, and they got generous external support, and that was very specific to the region, not conditional on political progress. So they ended up stabilizing gradually, hesitating on structural change. And this gave rise to the period in the 90s and 2000s with the rollback of the state, the imbalanced form of crony capitalism that didn't create many jobs, all of which ultimately led to the Arab Spring, to the unhappiness that led to the Arab Spring. Now, today, I would argue for many countries, the situation is actually more difficult than in the 80s, which would make the trilemma even harder. First, let's focus on debt, on external financing, the public debt situation, and I'm not showing slides and numbers. You just read the IMF, WIO, there's plenty of numbers there. The external debt situation is worse. Already we have 9 to 10 countries that are at risk of debt distress. The bilaterals are unlikely to be as generous as in the past coming out of COVID. There are budget constraints. On the financing side, cooperation is going to be much harder among bondholders. Much of external debt now is bonds and not banks. And moreover, many governments have also borrowed from their domestic banks. Think of the Lebanese situation. Egypt, Tunisia are not as bad as Lebanon, but are on a similar path with a potential financial crisis that would be if you like, a triple shock, external, internal, and banking at the same time. Also, geopolitical rents have eroded, and that is also why bilaterals are not as likely as before to be generous. Some countries were too large to fail and are becoming, one could say, too large to bail now. Number two, and very importantly, the oil price decline. Then in the 80s, there was a shock, an oil shock, and today there's an oil shock. It's of larger magnitude. Oil prices came from higher to quite low. Revenues in the region, oil revenues were close to $1 trillion in 2015. They are down to 400-500 billion today. So it's a huge drop. And it comes after a long oil boom of more than 10 years, making the need adjustment harder. And oil prices are unlikely to recover this time, unlike the first time where many countries just smoothed that period until the 2000s. There's been further deindustrialization in the meanwhile. Population are larger. Export growth is going to be harder. The global economy is not expanding. Many countries now depend on tourism, which is not very reliant. And remittances are also on the decline as countries in the GCC nationalize their labor force increasingly. And finally, the street is increasingly not just boiling, but calling for regime change. Unlike the past, where it was just calling for more subsidies. In some countries, in several countries, at least 3, the military are now on the front line, searching for a way of ruling without governing, which is difficult. So moving to part 3, what are the trends that we're seeing? Of course, we are going to live with this predicament for many years to come, but already there are some trends. And I think the big difference with the 80s is that there is lots more variation than before. There actually, I counted 5 categories of reform genres that we can see in the region. So the first is what I would call the political reformists. Of course, Tunisia is number 1 there. It has moved on 3, political liberalization, but it's finding it, maybe because of that, very hard to address the first and second challenge, the fiscal and the structural. Fragile coalition have a hard time making decisive decisions. Will the risk ahead shape up the political system? I don't know. Maybe Mustapha will tell us. In Sudan, the situation is not that different. Also, the deal between the army and protesters had led to progress on the political side. For now, international support is easing the fiscal problem, but here too there is very strong opposition to structural reform, including by the protesters themselves. And possibly Iraq may be going that path. So that's the political reformers. Then we have Saudi Arabia, category of its own. I would call them the voluntarists. Saudi Arabia is moving on fiscal and structural, on 1 and 2, doing which is rarely done, which is cutting consumption, cutting expenditure altogether, and within that, cutting consumption and increasing investment quite massively. Now, here you really have 2 political bets. One is that the public sector can create a private sector, because much of the financing is coming from public sector, a bit a la Asia. And the second, the more political bet, is that providing the youth what we could call amusement rights, will compensate them for lower consumption and harder work. A big bet here. We'll see how this evolves. It should be noted that there are 2 countries, Oman and Bahrain, in the GCCs that have financial difficulties, unlike the past. Will they be following up the Saudi strategy? Remains to be seen. The third category is what I would call the countries that are back into the 90s. And Egypt there, I think, is the main, where the adjustment resembled really what it did in the 80s, a gradual fiscal adjustment with little progress on structural change and on political opening. Jordan and Morocco are broadly in this category, although they are doing more on 2 and 3. But if two doesn't move fast enough, if growth doesn't pick up, that sustainability is becoming a big issue in both countries. Then we have a group that is in a wait-and-see attitude, fragile regime perhaps, that still have some reserves, some foreign exchange reserve that they are spending and not doing anything in terms of absorbing the shock. Lebanon, Algeria are in this situation. Lebanon, in spite of its collapse, has not undertaken any policy to resolve the crisis. There's still, unfortunately, $20 billion of external reserves to burn before things may change. And finally, we have also, unlike the 80s, we have many countries now really stuck in a violence trap. Of course, Syria, Yemen, Libya, Palestine, perhaps Iraq, perhaps Lebanon, unless they manage to pull themselves out of this group. So 5 countries, 5 types of approaches that are very different. Now, to conclude, can we expect different political resolutions in the 20s than in the 80s? How are the main actors behaving in potentially a different way? I mean, now, like then, and perhaps now more than then, it is clear that most of our countries are way below their potential. And the main failure is political. It comes from the fact that losers have a very high voice. The winners have very little voice. Most of them do not see a different future where they would be winners. And how to build more coalition for change, where we can have collective action for public good, is the big challenge. Now, if we look at the different actors, the poor in the 80s were hurt and repressed. Food subsidies were eliminated, little jobs were created for them. Now the IMF, which is becoming already active in most of the countries, is insisting on a social safety net. 1-2% of GDP, would that satisfy the poor in the short term? To be seen. The approach on the middle class, it seems to me, and this is pure speculation really, seems to be different. It was broadly neutralized through subsidies in the 80s, energy subsidies in particular, and really politically divide and rule strategy. Seculars against Islamic, ethnic, tribal, religious differences in some countries. Similar strategies are being attempted. Just look at Algeria, for example, but hopefully they won't be successful this time around. Now, there seem to be some considerations now by regimes to continue to occupy the height of the economy, whether it's with cronies or military firms or FDI from friendly countries, but to also occupy the middle class more than before with SMEs, subcontract basically the business to SMEs. 5 to 10% of the financing is being considered in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, in other countries. Now, this strategy really is questionable whether it can work at all, especially that these firms are way far from the global technology frontiers, but this remains to be seen. Now, just to conclude with a ray of hope, one thing we can hope for, that if the social movements can start laying a vision for a future that's more specific, identifying reforms that would benefit the youth, make their demands really more specific, that could constitute a focal point perhaps for coordination, and making it more realistic to have a gradual political opening on the back of a virtuous cycle of rising social trust that increasingly facilitate, one could say, collective action. But equally, unfortunately, there is a risk of negative loops that threaten to create vicious circle in countries that are unable to at least initiate a cycle of change at this moment. Let me keep it at that.
Thank you very much, Ishac. Thank you for laying out the big picture and also giving us that historical reference point with the situation in the 90s. You talked a bit about the Maghreb and talked about Tunisia, but I'm sure Mustapha will bring a whole range of perspectives to that region. So Mustapha, could I turn to you next, please, for your thoughts?
Thank you, Masood, and thank you, Ishac, for this excellent broad picture looking across countries and across time. Actually, in the same vein, I would like to compare then and now, if you like, and start with the idea that while we look at the economic issues in terms of austerity or non-austerity, structural reforms, and so on, let's look at the initial conditions from the political and security perspective, and see how now differs from then. And it is striking to me when we look back at the 80s and the mid-80s and the 90s. The big concern in all of the countries of the region, with the exception of one, was how to maintain stability. The mot d'ordre, if you like, anywhere was how to keep the political stability, how to maintain the security situation for the regimes, and so on. And this has shaped in many ways the way economic reforms were undertaken or not undertaken. And broadly speaking, the concern with maintaining security and political stability meant that you do the least possible structural reforms which will, kind of disrupt the equilibrium. You do not want to develop too much of private sector, because the private sector will be jeopardizing the political system. You do not want to unwind too much the subsidy system and the public employment schemes that were in place, because that will disturb the political equilibrium. You don't want a capitalist system in which, or an open system. You want the rents to remain in place as much as possible to satisfy your support base, and so on. So that's what shaped essentially the extent and speed of reforms, of economic reforms at that time. Now, I mentioned there was one exception. The one exception in the 80s and the 90s, which was not in that situation, was Algeria. Algeria was in a situation where the political stability was already broken, and the country was in the process in a political instability and even in civil war by the 90s. And it's very interesting that Algeria was the one which, instability led it to a situation where it had even less reforms than the rest. It was stuck even more than the other countries which had attempted to do some. So except the fiscal kind of adjustment that they had to do, because they had the big debt problem, so they had to do the debt reprofiling and all of that. Besides that, nothing else happened essentially. So except for what was, kind of imposed on them, there was not much. Now, fast forward and let's look at the 2010s and as the 2020s, as we start them now, and how does it look like? The landscape is quite different, actually. It's fundamentally different. For sure, there is a group of countries where the situation looks like the 80s and the 90s. They are more or less politically stable. The security is under control. You look at the GCC; they are probably in that format. Morocco is probably in that format. Maybe to some extent Jordan, and Algeria is also in the stability. It's not in the previous situation. Algeria today looks like the other countries like 20 years ago or 30 years ago. On the other hand, we have a big group, which we did not have then. We have at least, 8 countries, which are in the middle of political turmoil and middle of insecurity in many ways. Whether it is the 4 Arab Spring countries, Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, and so on, or whether the conflict countries, whether it's Yemen or Syria and Iraq and so on. So we have a bunch of countries. We have at least half of the Arab countries in the region who are in the middle of political instability in one way or the other, and lots of insecurity and security issues prevailing. So we are considering what are the possible reforms for these countries now, and how can they move forward. And it is interesting to see that really undertaking reforms is handicapped in many, many ways for these countries, which were not the same that we saw like in the 80s and the 90s. What are the constraints, if you like, if you think about it? Political instability and trying to deal and manage political instability and insecurity means that governments are weak, typically weak. They're short-term oriented. They cannot look long-term because they don't have horizons, long-term horizons. And they have very little medium and long-term vision. The building conditions and coalitions for reform seem almost impossible to build. And because specific interests, corporate, professional interests really prevail on the collective visions. And more importantly, which is new, I think, and we tend not to forget, now, is that state capacity has been diminished very, very, very big time. State capacity in the countries we have been going through the turmoil and the insecurity has seen their states really weaken a lot. And they didn't have even the limited and somewhat not imperfect capacity they had 20 or 30 years ago. So this means that they have the ability to design and implement reforms is really much, much weaker. This, to me, means that undertaking these reforms, whether the fiscal or the structural reforms and so on, is really becoming very, very difficult these days, much more difficult. And it looks very much like what Algeria was like in the 80s and the 90s, what was facing. I mean, Tunisia today is very much like Algeria, like in the 90s. It's facing the same constraints in terms of its ability to undertake reforms and so on. So the lessons from Algeria are interesting and are really worth looking at today, even though Algeria today is behaving differently from it was like 30 years ago. But the lessons are worth it, and it's interesting to look at in many ways. So this means that really we have to learn these lessons and see. So what are the broad lessons that I think that we have learned from then and from now, if you like? I think, I think I am a little bit concerned by getting stuck in the trilemma of Ishac. I think countries of the region don't have that choice of managing trilemmas, because we know that selecting one and dropping the other two is a failure, leads to failure. If you do fiscal and you don't know structural, you don't do political opening, you are bound to fail. If you do structural and don't do any one of the other two, you are bound to fail. If you do the political reform, and as Tunisia has shown, and if you don't do any of the structural and the fiscal, you are bound to fail, and that's where we are heading at. So really, we don't have a choice than to deal with the three at the same time. There is no other option, actually, to me. If we do not develop ways and ideas on how to undertake reforms at the political level, at the macro level, stabilization and structural reform at the same time, I think we are going to go into very, very difficult times in the period ahead. We are going to go into chaotic situations. Chaos is going to be the options if we don't manage to combine and succeed in the three dimensions that Ishac has developed to us. The problem is that we as people who think about these issues and so on, I think we have given very little thought about how to manage all of this together. And I think if there is something that we need to think about is us. And I would go, I will go against what Ishac said, really, rather than, putting it in terms of trilemmas and, telling us that we can probably play around with two instead of, trying to achieve, that would be, kind of not very, very helpful in many ways. Let me, that's my main message, if you like, but let me just give one additional point in that direction. I think the reforms in the 2020s have got to look different from what they looked at in the region in the 80s and the 90s in at least two ways. I think they have got to pay a lot more attention to inequality. I think inequality was given very, very little attention in the 80s and the 90s. We thought and we believed ourselves that inequality was not an issue in the region, but it turned out to be a major issue, and it is shaping the political landscape today everywhere. So inequality has got to be at the heart of anything that could be designed and done as we go forward. And the second thing that we have got to pay much more attention to is economic insecurity, not only inequality, but economic insecurity as well. Because the world that is upon us now, with the need to do all of this reform, but also with all of the shocks that are coming from technology, from the new globalization that is emerging, or deglobalization, or whatever it is, digitalization, all of this is creating a lot of potential for insecurity. And if insecurity is not at the heart of any policy agenda, we are going to have to live with this chaos and with, trilemma in its extreme form that it has told us. So the policy agenda today has got to be designed differently, has its content to be different from what, and the focus of it has to be different from, because in the age of the social media, in the age of the, what we see as the importance of political reform that has to be on the agenda and so on, means that the content of the policy reform has got to be very, very different, and the focus very different from it was 20, 30 years ago. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Mustapha. And I think when we have a discussion, I want to come back to Ishac a bit about the point that Mustapha raised in terms of whether or not whether the trilemma is really a operationally or policy-wise meaningful set of choices, or whether in effect the real question becomes, how can you move on all three together? And in a way, you could also think of two of those dimensions as being constraints. You can't do stuff in terms of fiscal without running into a problem, and you can't do stuff on the political without running into social protest. And in a way, your structural reform and growth agenda is what you want. So it's in a way your objective is to increase growth, and the other two are things that make it hard to do that. So we'll have a discussion, I hope, when we come back to that. But before we do that, I'd like to turn at this point now to Dr. Razaz. Omar, over to you, please.
Thank you, Masood, and I'm delighted to see all friends and colleagues. Let me pick up from where Ishac and Mustapha left. I think the trilemma is useful because it reminds us that this is not a time anymore for piecemeal action. We cannot do things piecemeal anymore. We don't have the luxury. And I'll get into that in a minute. But let me just go back a little bit. In 2011, I wrote a paper in Arabic, the title of which is The Difficult Road Towards a New Arab Social Contract. And at the time, people said, this was 2011, they said, you're too pessimistic. Why do you say it's the difficult road to a new Arab social contract? And when I wrote it in English a few years later, I changed the title, made it the treacherous road towards a new Arab social contract. And now with maybe 6 or 7 failed states, Arab states, that don't even provide security, it's getting bleaker and bleaker and harder to achieve. But yet I don't think the challenges are insurmountable, and I do think there is a way out. On Ishac's 3 items, in Jordan, the reducing the deficit, and that applies to most countries, is actually very difficult. We're starting to get at the bone, precisely because 70 or 80% of our budget is on current expenditures, and 70, 80% or more is on salaries. So, so that in itself, there's not much more you can do unless you take that bold issue of the current expenditure and employment, and that can only be done as part of a new social contract. You cannot just do it as if, sort of life as normal. And structural reforms, Jordan has done a lot of the structural reforms, and there was a 5-year program for reforms agreed with internationally, and Jordan satisfied all aspects. So, but Jordan lives in a very tough neighborhood. Jordan is a small economy, essentially with closed borders. So there is, you can do all the reforms you want, but without being able to export, without being able to grow your SME sector, etc., without creating jobs for the hundreds of thousands of unemployed youth, that's not giving an answer. And the third one, the political and economic, if you think of it in terms of concessions, I think you're going though in a dangerous track, because if it is concessions, the risks of that, and we've seen it, there is a lot. It's hard to get constructive outcomes. You'll open the door for populism, for people to simply focus on kind of grievances without actually putting any realistic alternatives on the ground. So for these reasons, I think that going back to a process through which, and it has to be a process through which, and where people really trust and understand the end point and the process to get there. And that's a social contract. Now, it's tough. It's very tough to do this in the Arab world, especially that we are going from, even in non-oil countries, we're going from rentierism to a productive democratic society. So the idea that the state gives you benefits either by hiring you in the public sector, and by doing that you acquiesce to accept the status quo as it is. This is no longer feasible, but yet the social contract, as the rest of the world understands it, the elements of it, as we know, are still not still there. So we're faced with these tough choices, and people see them in front of them. It's like chaos versus despotism. So, do you want a failed state, or do you want a state that is ruled by the army? No, we don't want either of those, and we want to focus on the third one, third option. But it really requires not just the state and the public sector kind of stepping back, but the population that has been dependent on this contract, if you will, to be weaned off of the traditional system of rentierism. So, so how do we go from here? How How do we go from here? It's not easy. It's probably extremely difficult, and I think the Mustapha description that we have weak states. You can't do this with weak states. You have weak states do not produce democracy and do not produce infrastructure and long-term public goods. They focus on the short term. So the state has to remain strong in the understand that it's rules by law and things like that. And at the same time, the population needs to understand and feel that the society is strong and the citizens are strong in terms of their rights as well. So it's a treaty of some sort. It's and it requires a process that is credible going forward. Now, since I was recently in government, people will ask, so what did you do, if anything, on this? I think, well, the term social contract was in our government's proposal first to Parliament, and we talked about what that entails, and that it should focus on accountability and transparency and participation and rights and responsibilities, and the notion that if you pay taxes, then the government is accountable to you to explain where that money is going through. The reception was not that great from right or left or religious or secular parties for various reasons, but we nonetheless went through the initial steps of setting up an accountability system, where we would say, here's from all the strategies that Jordan has done in the last 10 years, here is the collection of these strategies, and here is what we propose as the next 2 to 3 year action plan, and with clear objectives and clear indicators. And an accountability process where people can on a regular basis see what has been accomplished and what hasn't. This was all cut too short because of Corona, because of the COVID, because of all sorts of issues that we had witnessed. So I can't say that we've completely put the rail on the track, but one of the things that remain to be done, but this government is in the process of doing, is revising the election law itself. And that's very important, but not as a piecemeal thing, but as it's really important to put it in the broader context. So where do we go from here? There are no easy answers. Democracy was never a textbook case where you just sort of put in the ingredients and you get democratic state or democratic societies. But I don't believe that this should be an excuse for us not to go there. It's just like swimming. You can't learn it unless you go through it, but you do need to build a strong state for that transition period. Otherwise, we have failed democracies all over the world, and these are as dangerous, if not more, to totalitarian regimes. So strong states are very important. Strong societies, with our definition of strong states, is very important. Regional issues, regional conflicts, all these made up conflicts in Yemen and Libya and what have you. And a country like Jordan will have a very, very hard time growing and becoming more stable and moving into the next century without addressing the issue of Palestine. And, we seem to kind of, there's so much wishful thinking about burying the Palestinian issue one way or the other, but every few years it creeps up again. And this is something that is essential, because otherwise this poisonous atmosphere will keep repeating the conflicts that we are seeing, and mostly secondary conflicts that aren't aren't really needed or helpful in any way, shape, or form. Democracy, as we said, has to be built. And in Jordan, one of the things that I think are very effective, and maybe in many other countries, are municipalities. Municipalities in Jordan are about 100 years old and are democratic. And who you elect mayor, if he's your cousin or and they're not good, it affects you directly. So we've had a track record of democracy at a very basic level. Now that needs to move up at the governorate level, and then at a national level with an election law that is really encourages a parliament that holds government accountable. And that needs to be put in a time frame, very clear time frame. And that all has to be discussed in a broadly with social groups, parties, unions, etc., to arrive at what is that time frame and the content of time frame exactly involved. The last thing I want to say is, what does this mean for what do we do in the short term, and what are essential building blocks in the long term? In the short term, I think the issue of youth empowerment and youth employment is essential in all the Arab countries. Unemployment rates among youth in Jordan are in the 30s, and in much higher among females than males, and it's not sustainable. And that begs the question of how do you do this when your economy is not growing and fiscal? And this brings me to the issue of providing social services in our countries. There are so many services and goods that are not being provided that can be provided and add value through youth groups. And in a sense, I'm being a bit of a Keynesian, but I'm not talking about just digging holes in the ground and filling them. I'm talking about missing elements of public goods that are not being provided, that the government has assumed it would provide them, but we know with quality of public services very, very often in health, in education, in environment, in recycling, in agriculture, etc., there is a room for that. The question of how do you provide that, how do you pay for that is complicated, but I think this, unless we do something very soon on this social media and the environment and the post-COVID era where we're gonna see the real unemployment figures soon, this is a time bomb that we cannot engage. What about the long term? One word: trust. Trust has been the victim of all of these years of governments trying different things, etc. This has to be a credible process that builds trust, and it might require governments to stick to the letter of the early agreements so that trust can be gradually rebuilt. I fully agree with what Mustapha said about the need to focus on social services and a sense of justice and transparency in our processes going forward. So I'll stop here and thank you very much all for taking time.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for putting this question, which we come back to, of a new social contract. And a new social contract, both in terms of what it would look like, the content of it, and also the process by which you get agreement, both on the need to have such a new social contract. And you said yourself that the initial reaction was a little bit mixed, but then also on what the content of it should be. What should people expect, and what should they be able to hold the state accountable for? And the question then becomes, to what extent are the states ready themselves to accept that social contract. So to what extent are they willing to be held accountable? And that, I think, will be an interesting part of the conversation of also building trust. To what extent can you build trust if you have if you put in constraints on what you say you're willing to accept as accountability? So we'll come back to that. Nader, you have the final perspective, if you like, looking at the countries of the Gulf, GCC in particular. So can I turn to you, please, now?
Thank you so much, Masood, and many thanks to ERF for hosting this excellent session. I think I'll build on the conversation so far and what Omar was saying is in terms of what the social contract entails in the Gulf region. I think the Gulf is similar to many countries, most countries in the Middle East. They're basically based on a rentier system that provides access to public sector jobs, public services and benefits, and access to business opportunities as well for those who are connected in some way to the regime. The main difference I would argue is that in the context of the Gulf, even though as Haq points out, the Gulf does have a timeline in terms of eventually running out of oil and gas and needing to introduce reforms. The main difference is that these channels, the rentier channels, basically act as a way for Gulf countries to distribute their wealth from oil and gas to their citizens. As such, you can think of these channels, I mean, from the perspective of Gulf citizens, these are kind of legitimate ways for them to access their share of the national wealth. And so that adds another layer of complexity to it. But as the Gulf states eventually diversify and move away from economies that are heavily dependent on oil and gas, they're going to be facing many of the same problems as other countries of the Middle East. In fact, that's kind of what's happening right now. In the long term, oil and gas will eventually run out. And Bahrain is essentially no longer really produces any amounts of oil to speak of. Oman is maybe a couple of decades behind. And so these are important considerations. The International Monetary Fund produced a report and published it before COVID that estimated that GCC countries, if they don't undertake substantial fiscal and economic reforms, will deplete their wealth that they've conserved, which is around, in terms of their sovereign wealth funds and other savings, by 2034. Not deplete their oil and gas reserves from many other countries, but at least their wealth. And oil and gas reserves will no longer, revenues from oil and gas will no longer really cover their basic expenses. So they're on a short timeline as well. So what are the key issues facing countries of the Gulf? Essentially, countries of the Gulf have been trying for decades actually to diversify their economies, and they've made some progress. Basically, they have been, their main objective is to reduce the production of oil and gas with goods and services that are not dependent directly or indirectly on the oil and gas sector. And this is where they've been struggling. So even if you see diversification, a lot of that is into construction, infrastructure, major projects that rely indirectly on revenues from oil and gas. So diversification is happening, but it's still a little bit illusionary. It's not real substantial diversification. Oil and gas still represents over 40% of GDP in most countries of the GCC. And in terms of revenues, government revenues, about 70%. And to get a sense of diversification efforts, you have to really think about what are the Gulf countries producing that they can trade with the rest of the world for goods and services from other countries of the world that would replace oil and gas. And this gives you a sense of how far Gulf countries still have to go. So 90% of total exports to Kuwait and Qatar, and 80% Saudi Arabia and Oman, and over 40% from the UAE and Bahrain are still basically hydrocarbons and related products. So the long and short of it is GCC countries still have a long way to go. So diversification efforts have been taking place, as we said, but still really heavily reliant in terms of revenues from oil and gas. Okay, how do we square these challenges with the political economy of Gulf states and this structure, this rentier structure, whereby citizens are gaining their access to the wealth through these various channels? And understanding this can help us identify maybe areas for economic diversification that haven't really been considered. In fact, over decades, there have been many studies by consultants and by the governments themselves and by international organizations. But oftentimes, these diversification studies have not looked at the situation through a political economy lens of the governing social contract. So there's benefit to looking at this. So let's break this up into individual parts. One of the key areas where Gulf states initially diversified, really, well, they took revenues from oil and gas, and they built up national champions in various sectors. So large state-owned enterprises in banking, insurance, transportation, many sectors that oftentimes are the purview of the private sector. And initially, those large state-owned enterprises served an important function. They spurred innovation, they spurred growth, they helped diversify economies, at least to an extent. But eventually, they came to dominate their sectors. And in fact, in many cases, serve as an effective, if behind the scenes regulator of those sectors. And so they're preventing further innovation and growth and diversification within those sectors. So the first thing that the Gulf states need to do is figure out how to better regulate these state-owned enterprises and create a space where there's true competition within these spaces. As far as I can see, most of these state-owned enterprises still rely indirectly on government support. They're really not able to compete globally except through some sort of support, and so they're not part of the real diversification that needs to take place. A second area that is important is the issue of, and that gets to the heart of economic diversification, is the issue of real private sector development. And here we get into the political economy situation where business owners, Gulf nationals who are business owners, access their share of the wealth through special government contracts or services or other forms of agreements that allow them to access monopolistic rents. So not to really engage in real competition within their sectors. It's difficult to see how this is going to change anytime soon. Business owners connected to Gulf states will continue to expect this kind of access. So what can be done? Well, the key thing that can be done is to draw clear lines between those sectors that rely directly or indirectly on revenues from oil and natural gas, and those sectors that are more growth oriented, that do not rely indirectly on revenues from oil and natural gas. And basically they can become export oriented, growth oriented, technology sectors, new sectors. And here, Gulf countries really need to ensure that these growth-oriented sectors are given a chance to essentially grow, create jobs, create exports that will allow the economies to develop and diversify. So clearly defining those sectors and those different types of sectors, I think, is a key step towards ensuring that you have a proper economic diversification. And you're starting to see that throughout Gulf countries, through special economic zones, through free zones, and other areas where the government essentially has created a space where these private sector entities can compete. Bahrain has gone even further because it's the country that's been under most pressure in terms of reduced revenues from oil and gas, and so they've been ahead of the curve in terms of creating these kinds of spaces for the private sector to develop. Dubai as well has been ahead of the curve, way ahead of the curve, and the reason is that Dubai also, as an emirate, it also kind of had to deal with lower revenues from oil and natural gas in the 1990s, and essentially chose to diversify its economy and essentially grow these sectors. So one criticism would be, well, how do we know which sectors Gulf countries can compete in globally? Well, you need to experiment. You need to create the space for innovation to take place and see what works. I mean, go back 40 years. Could you imagine that Dubai would become a global hub for finance, for logistics, for tourism? So it's managed to achieve this. And Gulf countries need to look a little bit at their comparative advantage and find out how to leverage those. In the case of Qatar, where I currently live, for example, Qatar Airways is now the second largest carrier in the world in terms of air cargo. How can Qatar leverage this position in the market? And this is only after Federal Express. How can it leverage this position in the market to support trade, light manufacturing, and other kinds of logistics and other kinds of services? So that's on the economic diversification side. The final challenge, which we talk about a lot, is the issue of employment. So Gulf citizens are able to access their share of the economic rents by obtaining jobs in the public sector that are secure, that are prestigious, and that pay quite a bit more than they would get in the private sector. And many Gulf states, Bahrain, Oman, and Saudi Arabia, are having difficulty essentially maintaining that level of commitment to hiring nationals and paying them high wages. In fact, they haven't been able to. And so what you see in these countries is much lower rates of nationals being able to access these lucrative public sector jobs. And as Ahmed pointed out previously, unemployment rates among young nationals in the GCC states is actually quite high. As a region, among nationals, youth unemployment rates are over 30%, which means unemployment rates among GCC nationals are higher than the average for the Middle East and North Africa. Not all countries are the same. Qatar has been able to absorb its young entrants fairly well. Kuwait and Saudi and the UAE to a lesser extent, and Bahrain has been forced to absorb them. So its actually rates are kind of closer to the global area average. In Saudi Arabia, unemployment rates among young Saudis is over 35%, and actually I think it's dropped a little bit below now 35%, but it's fairly high. And so, what can be done here? Here you need an honest conversation with the citizens about the financial constraints. Young people in the Gulf have come to expect their ability to access public sector jobs and get upset when they haven't been able to. The governments in Saudi Arabia, Oman, Bahrain, and others are trying to pass along the responsibility for hiring young nationals to the private sector, and they've created quota systems like Mitaqat in Saudi Arabia, and Omanization programs, amortization programs, where they try to set quotas or financial incentives, like wage subsidies, or to try to get the private sector to hire nationals. There's a couple of problems here. First of all, many nationals, without the context of a national dialogue on the issue, still perceive that those jobs in the private sector to be a way for them to access their share of the wealth. And it's really not acting like that. And the second thing is this places additional burdens on the private sector in the countries of the Gulf. And if we're asking the private sector to create jobs and grow and compete internationally, saddling them down with quotas and essentially maybe placing additional fees on foreign nationals who they hire in order to align wages for the nationals and foreign workers in those sectors, creates an additional burden, which Gulf countries can ill afford at a time when they're trying to diversify. So one way that Gulf countries can do that ahead of a national dialogue, as part of a national dialogue, is to start thinking in terms of creating a social wage. Let the market set wages competitively for national workers, and then add on a social wage that represents their nationals' ability to access their share of the wealth through that social wage. Think of it like an earned income tax credit in the US. At least things become transparent. The key idea here really is that untangling the social contract requires initially having a conversation and creating more transparency in terms of kind of these lines and these rules and what can be expected. What can be expected in terms of employment policies, what can be expected in terms of diversified sectors and ensuring that you have a sector that's competing globally and able to grow, and allowing sectors that are dependent on oil and gas revenues to have some clear space where these lines are clear and distinct. I think lessons from the Gulf can also be applied to other countries in the Middle East, and having some clarity about these elements of the social contract can help us kind of find a process, or as Omar also said in the talk just before, a way out. And I look forward to taking that conversation on next. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nader. Thank you, all of you, for those very rich set of remarks that we have on the table. We already have some questions people are asking. I thought maybe there are three sets of issues we might talk about a little bit now. The first is just to go back a bit to the initial framing of the macro that Ishac did on the trilemma, and want to push back a little bit on that set of questions. And Ishac, you saw one of the questions in the Q&A was basically saying, is there really a trilemma? I mean, why can't we do modern monetary theory and just spend our way out of all this? So, look at what's happening in the US, a big fiscal deficit, lots of spending, lose money. Why are we not able to do this? And I have my own views on why that doesn't apply, but it would be good to get the views of panelists on how much of these are self-imposed. And it's linked a little bit also to another question, which is to what extent is this session, this set of constraints kind of imposed by international institutions, and then how much of it is objective reality? So it would be good to get a little bit your and other sense. The second question, I believe, is the one that Omar, you put on the table, but in a way everybody has been getting into it, which is how does one actually go about building a new social contract? And I think the question really is, you talk about strong states and populations willing to do it, and this would all be great, but that's not where we are right now. So how does one actually go to building that? And in a way, Nader, a lot of what you were talking about was really a new social contract between citizens and states about the nature of expectations. Can they be guaranteed a job for life? Is that a job where they're paid what the market wage is, or their expectation of what they should be paid? Is it a sharing of rent? So I think that's the second. And finally, I hope if we have a bit of time, it would be good to talk a bit about sort of diversification. Everybody wants to diversify, but how many countries in the Gulf can have an airline, a financial center, and a tourism and logistics hub? All you can't keep replicating that model over and over without running into some fallacy of composition. And also, there's a question in my mind: can you actually diversify and build a competitive private sector, not just in the oil economy, without touching the way the public sector operates? So is it a sort of separate endeavor? You sort of go out and build this, or is it about fundamentally rethinking the nature of the public sector? What is the role of the state in all this? What is the role of public enterprises, state-owned enterprises? Are they part of new industrial policy, or are they the reason why we don't have effective innovation? It's going to be interesting to get your views. So maybe let's start with the first macro question. I'll turn to you, Ishac, first on that. And then if anybody else wants to comment on that, then we'll go to the other topics.
Well, I mean, mighty questions on the table. There goes the future of the region, right? Perhaps we want to bring a bit more political of the political economy to answer those. I mean, what I see as a trilemma is a trilemma for regimes trying to survive. Now, I totally agree with Mustapha that the way to deal with the situation is to move on, ideally, on all those three dimensions, you know, political, fiscal, and structural. The problem comes, and I approach my analysis in a positive way, that many regimes feel threatened to move in more than one direction. So it is in many ways self-imposed. But I must say it's not only self-imposed. I mean, many LDCs are now dealing with these problems of access to financial resources. You know, they cannot print dollars. You know, the US is sucking the savings of the world these days. Europe is running very large deficit. The rest of the world, Africa has been vaccinated at 1% of its population right now. We're approaching 30 to 50% in the rest of the world. So there is also that aspect. But the main point I want to put on the table is that regime and states are two different things. And the regime doesn't always operate to the benefit of the state. I mean, look at the Lebanese situation. We literally have a regime against the state. Look at, I mean, let me pick my examples carefully. Look at Algeria. The army is now spending a third of oil revenues. It used, when oil price was high, it used to be spending 10% of it only. To what extent is the takeover driven by the national interest versus corporatist interests? And so, you know, in many cases, you need regime evolution, if not change, in order to strengthen the state. In most of the countries we talked about, the regime doesn't liberalize the market because it fears having new autonomous competitors that would want to have a claim into the governing coalition. And so they give up potential growth in order to preserve a certain degree of authority. So I think we need to bring that also to the table. And it's really for that reason that I'm not particularly fond of the notion of social contract. It's as if something descends from the sky. I'm much more comfortable with the notion of a political settlement, let's say. You know, the politics have to change in order for a new social contract to come to the table. If I put a gun on your head and I you know, dare you to accept a social contract, you'll accept it. But this is not in the sense of Rousseau, of you know, a freely accepted contract by all members of society. Can I also say a word on diversification, or do you want to leave this for later?
Let's come back to diversification, Ishac, if I may. And I think just to be clear, because there is a question on the table, I mean, I think you were saying, if I understood correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that, you know, the freedom that the United States and other countries who have credit markets that are willing to give them credit have to be able to borrow large amounts of, you know, the kinds of expenses that we saw last year. The fact that they were able to do 15 or more % of GDP in rich countries, 6% in terms of emerging markets, and 2% for low-income countries, is just a reflection of the economic reality of how much they can expand before they hit constraints. So the notion of spending your way out of this trilemma is not a realistic one for most countries in the region. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, and I would say it's partly because the way the word is, but it's also partly because of moral hazard, right? I mean, ideally, yes, Tunisia would have very large financing in order to pass this bump, and at the same time follow Mustapha's advice of improving the democracy, engage in structural adjustment, and get out of this trilemma this way. However, it hasn't worked so far. Whatever financing was made available went into consumption. The government didn't have the authority or the courage to move on structural adjustment because of veto players and the like. So it is partly also self-imposed. How to find a way to move on the three is the key. And I totally agree with speakers on this.
Right.
Unfortunately, we haven't seen a country. Maybe I should create a sixth category and put some countries that are trying to do that. Jordan would be there. Jordan under Omar would be one of those.
We'll get the view. So let's morph into this discussion of how do you create then, whether you call it a political settlement, you call it a social compact or a social contract, how does one go about creating an agreement on what needs to be done that people voluntarily step into rather than are coerced into in some ways? So maybe Omar, then I'll come back to Mustapha on that, because I think Mustapha, it is also very much a discussion that you and I have had over many years in the context of Tunisia also. Omar, do you want to say something on that first, and then I come to Mustapha, please? I know you have to go earlier.
I'm not sure what to say because the discussion is a little bit loose. But let me say that we know from experience from the last 30, 40 years, 50 years, any big bang attempt to solve one issue, one of the three dimensions, has failed. Tunisia is not an attempt to move on the three dimensions. It's just one attempt to reform the political process. It has completely ignored the fiscal and the structural agenda. And that's why it's failing to me. I think Egypt is one way to solve one big bang to solve the fiscal issue. And that's why I think it is it has lots of question mark over where it's going. So I don't see any country which has tried in an organized way to move in an organized way. The only case that I tentatively can point out to is Morocco. The only exception is Morocco, which has been trying to move in a slow and a balanced way along the three dimensions. To some extent, I am not saying that is successful or fully or so, but on the face of it, it's making progress on the political front, but not extremely successful. It's making some success on the structural reform front, but not completely successful. Growth is stalling and it's not, but at least it has maintained some degree of stability and some degree of progress, social and economic progress. So to me, Morocco may be providing the beginning of an answer to what we are talking about, of how to get. Now, this poses an issue, which I have been kind of mulling over for some time. Do monarchies have a superior potential to republics on this? And the evidence is that monarchies have had a better potential on this one, because monarchies have been able to build around them some attempts to develop a new framework. It is not always successful. I'm not saying that's the only way, but we know that republics have been failures all along. I mean, we cannot cite an example of a success in republics. Now, this is a very serious issue if we talk about political economy. Why is it that republics have been failing? The issue of legitimacy of the political system has remained since the 50s or the 40s, has remained central, and it has not been resolved. The issue of legitimacy has not been resolved in republics, because it's the military, it is somebody X, somebody Y, and this and that, and it has been kind of going back and forth, and has not been resolved today. And in a way, Tunisia is an example of trying to resolve it, and that's what, but it has not succeeded yet to resolve it. And that's and as soon as it opens up, it becomes, you know, is it the religion which was the basis of legitimacy? Is it civil? Is it something else? And you get into that, and that debates, and these debates are still open and are not resolved. Monarchies have, in one way or the other, built around their monarchs some degree of legitimacy, and have been able to build around it some. And I'm not saying that's the only solution or that's the best solution, but I think it's something that we have to observe, we have to recognize. And maybe I leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Mustapha. So when I come to now that I mean, of course, the Gulf countries all have some version of monarchy. So it'd be interesting also to see how that has translated into that set of country. Omar, could I turn to you, please, now, and then just get a bit your sense of, you know, how do you start to build that sense of common purpose, that social contract, political settlement, on what you should expect from each other and what people should expect from the state, and the state should expect from them going forward?
Masood, just one observation, one comment.
Please, Mustapha, yes?
I want to call your attention, just for your information. I was talking about Morocco. Morocco has just completed what you can call a new social contract, or call whatever it is. They call it the new development model. There is a report that has been just issued, and it has been established by a group of 40 people, you know, personalities, and it is supposed to represent the ambition of the country on all fronts: economic, social, political, human rights, and whatever. I just wanted to point this out as an example. Maybe that needs to, I'm not saying that it's great or it's perfect. I keep my judgment on that one. I'm not saying anything on that front, but just one example of what a process like this might look like. And Morocco has gone through it. They have been working on it for a couple of years, I think, or something like that. And they have a report, and then they have a summary report, and then they have whatever. So just for information.
Thank you, Mustapha. And I think we'll try and see, maybe Sherry, if somebody is able to find a link to it while we're having this panel and puts up the link, that would be very helpful for people to take away that reference. Back to you, Omar.
Thanks, Masood. Just 3 quick points. You asked, how do you start that? There has to be the environment, the conditions where essentially everybody starts to realize that the risks are high and the status quo is not sustainable, and everybody can come out as a loser. And I think in most of our region, there is this realization that we need, that a transformation is needed. Now, everybody might have a different recipe for it. So that is very essential. In our government, we did actually relatively simple things, but I think are cornerstones in building that trust. Let me just give you the example of COVID. When COVID started, social media was flooded with misinformation about what COVID is and who has COVID and what hospitals have been shut down. And people were scared, didn't know what to believe, didn't know what to trust. And it was at that point that our government has decided to go out on almost a daily basis, the Minister of Information, Minister of Health, and just say the number of casualties, the number of deaths, the number of health, and every day. And we agreed that we would be accurate, whether the number was 0 or in the thousands, or we were facing we have to just, because anything is better than the environmental sort of information chaos and disinformation chaos. And I think the first few days or maybe a week, people were kind of suspicious and questioning, and are they hiding, is the government hiding something? But eventually people started paying attention to that press conference. This is a very small thing, but this is, I think, how you build trust in one brick at a time kind of thing, but engage in a process that people feel is going somewhere. And I just want to confirm Mustapha's assessment about monarchies, and I'll just give a small anecdote about the time. In 2007, I was heading the Social Security Corporation in Jordan, which ensures public sector, private sector, and the military. And the ILO did the report that said that in 2017, in 10 years, Social Security the funds will dive down and we will go bankrupt eventually. And when I saw this, I went to the government at the time and I said, we have to do something. And they said, no, not now. We have immediate things to worry about. But then I went to monarchy in Jordan. And when the monarchy became aware that 2017, yes, we're in 2007, but a problem that will happen 10 years from now is still a problem the monarchy will face, even if there are 5 governments interacting. There was a directive to sort of take the issue seriously and go into a dialogue, national dialogue about Social Security and benefits, etc., and come up with something different. And by 2010, we came up with a different law. So the short-termism that Mustapha and Ishac and were talking about is something that all governments in the region face. But if you have a longer sort of term tenure, if you will, then that incentivizes everybody to look at 10 years and 20 years down the road.
Thank you very much. Nader, what was your take on this question around this building a common understanding of the future? I mean, this is a question that presents itself in very large way for Gulf states, because if you look at some of the questions that were in the Q&A also, if we start talking about a low carbon or a future for the world, that has huge consequences for the economic revenue streams for Gulf countries. And the question then becomes, to what extent are people actually reaching a common vision of that future? How do you build that common vision? Omar, you wanted to say something before I turn to Nader?
I'll just say that, it's amazing. We think of a lot of people think that our population is not ready for democracy, but our population has not been given any information in the past about what the real problems are. Just to go back to the example of Social Security, when I came out and said we need a new law, the unions were up against this. But when we don't spend enough time, I think, in the region explaining what the problem is. We come up immediately with solutions, but people don't understand these are solutions for which problems. So you need, in the case of the Gulf countries, I think you need a transparent disclosure of what the next 30 years will look like for our children and grandchildren, so that we need to act now, and we need to act now in certain ways. And we can disagree on the policy that will come out, but at least let's agree on the information and the facts and disclose those, and that'll allow everybody to come together. And this is something that every time I've seen it done creates a level of maturity, as opposed to the populist rhetoric that simply decries everything and wants immediate results.
Thank you very much, Omar. Nader, your thoughts, please.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. I think the last point one of the last points I mentioned was that the importance of this having an honest dialogue between the states and the citizens, not just in the Gulf countries, across the Middle East. And this is something that is sorely lacking. We see again and again in this region and in the Gulf region and across the region, decisions and major policy shifts that are handed down. Sometimes they're handed down because you have enlightened leadership, let's say education reform across the Gulf that has been taking place. Let's dig a little bit deeper into education reform. The Gulf countries have not done very well on standardized international tests. The evidence is out there. Especially Gulf nationals, because many of them are incentivized to seek credentials or the minimum credentials that would allow them to access these government jobs we talked about. In Saudi Arabia, that could be like a 2-year post-secondary degree in humanities that would allow them to access these jobs, as opposed to kind of developing the skills and that they need to kind of build their economy in 20 years' time. Reforms have been taking place across the Gulf region, but oftentimes these are enlightened reforms, but reforms that are not communicated effectively to citizens. What is going on? Why is this important? Why are you suddenly required to learn a foreign language or to take additional courses in math? Why are you being incentivized to go into STEM and to do more science? And then you have pushback from the bottom sometimes, and changes are reversed suddenly because there hasn't been the chance for a dialogue. We've seen this in the labor market. 2017, the Saudi government reduced benefits for public sector workers, and there was a bunch of grumbling that took place, and then the decision was reversed. And that is because it's not a transparent process, unfortunately. Even when there's good intentions and when the process is based on solid data and information, that effort to really communicate and to bring everyone on the same page is still lacking. And it's so important because you realize that people are starting off from certain expectation. So across the region, young people today do not have the same economic opportunities as their parents and grandparents. They don't know why that is. They blame it on corruption. They blame it on ineffective governance. They blame it on all kinds of things. But if you look at, for example, GDP per capita adjusted for inflation, in the late 2000s and early 80s, it barely budged. Young people, they don't have the opportunities. They're wondering what's going on, and they have expectations based on their parents. I was in Syria before moving to Qatar, before the conflict erupted and the civil war erupted there. And we did a youth survey in 2011 as the conflict was getting underway. Young people perceived access to a job as a right, and the government as responsible for providing it. If you looked at some of the data we collected, there was an interest in the government keeping their end of the bargain, if you want the contract. Not many people wanted a new contract, but many of them wanted the government to keep their end of the bargain, to provide them with the services, to provide them with the jobs, to provide them with the security. And the same as in the Gulf. Young people in the Gulf today don't necessarily understand the fiscal constraints they face and the policy choices that are needed. And they have expectations based on what they've seen happen with their parents and their grandparents. And this is a problem. And I completely agree with Omar's assessment. You need a transparent dialogue that lays the issues on the table. And I think people are able to have that conversation. It doesn't happen overnight, but it's a process. It takes time. You build trust, you build a shared understanding, and that's the way you move forward.
Thank you very much, Masood. So let's try and just spend 10 minutes on the final topic, which was Ishac, coming back to you, diversification, but I would broaden that out to be a little bit also looking at industrial policy, role of the state, role of SOEs. And to somebody asked in the questions, I mean, is there a clear vision of what it is that we're talking about in terms of structural reforms, that would lead to all this? So any thoughts on that set of topics.
Yeah, no, I do. I still want to come back to put that on, to the issue of building trust.
Yes.
And you know, the horrible difference between chaos versus despotism. And for many youth in the streets these days, this seems to be the choice. You know, the question is, should we destroy the system in order to have a better one because it's unable to adapt itself? And I think what Omar puts on the table, you know, this issue of a conversation about the future, so that we move on the three fronts, as Mustapha said, is it. But what should this conversation be about? It should be about political inclusion, not just the plan. I mean, you need checks and balances for these plans to work as well. I think that's the key. If you can move on three, then moving on one and two at the same time can become credible. And I'm personally not sure that Morocco is doing that, but that's another conversation. Let's come to the issue of diversification. I really find the term not very helpful. Let's take the productive states and then the oil state rapidly. I mean, for the productive states that they don't have the rents and they have to create their living, it's really an issue of productivity, of increasing productivity, an efficient allocation of factors. You know, capital should go not to the connected ones, but to where it's most productive. Labor should have also go not to the state, but where it is most productive, land and the like. And also, very importantly, the issue of dynamic efficiency. You need competition, fair access, meritocracy for things to work, as opposed to a top-down allocation of economic power together with a political power that is, in many cases, myopic and defensive. And so it's about a process, not about products. We may not end up with many more products, but we'll end up with competitive products. And so I don't like it in that context, and I like it even less in the context of the oil states. And thinking in particular about Saudi Arabia, we could have a whole discussion of the political economy of the term diversification. You know, jobs for national is not a side issue. It is the issue. You know, there is no reason why nationals are unemployed, and then we say at the same time, you know, the economy will become more productive if we don't put quotas on foreign workers. I mean, what's beneficial to the country to create competitive industries built on expat laborers that benefit only a few political elites and are really a negative externality to the rest of the country? It doesn't make sense. So the heart of the issue is how to find jobs for national, not to diversify. Why should Saudi Arabia diversify into tradables? I mean, what is it can be competitive in besides perhaps tourism? It should simply follow much simpler than that. You know, the Norway model. It's an oil economy with efficient services run by nationals and machines instead of hordes of expats. I mean, I'm not against expats. Lots of Lebanese are expats, but the model made sense in the past because expats build the country, but you don't build a competitive industry, export industry of tradables on the back of expat. Doesn't make any sense. I mean, there's something good about Dutch disease. You know, it gives you some trickle down. So if you're in Saudi in services, you should be having a pretty high wage and not only having to go through the public sector, which cannot afford to hire you anymore. So I think this whole idea of diversification is being pushed by economic elites to create white elephants from which they can develop and they can profit. I mean, creating 2 million jobs in the next 10 years for Saudis shouldn't be that complicated when you have the public investment fund worth $500 billion. But I think we should help set a useful narrative instead of this mystifying one.
Great. So I think there's a whole separate seminar here that we need to organize. I just got to you, Mustapha. Next, I was going to say we're going to have a whole seminar on this because
I'm not sure I understand what you are saying, Ishac. Well, what do you mean diversification is I mean, getting jobs to the nationals is the issue of diversification itself. It's the issue itself. You need to diversify because you need to create jobs for the nationals. So you can say that the way it has been done, because creating jobs for the expats is wrong, but the issue of diversification is exactly the issue of finding now how to do it is the question. And how to do it in a country where the reservation wages are very high and the skills are very low of the nationals. So that is the issue of diversification in the GCC. And the issue is how do you jump, not like, you cannot do it like Asia when start with a low skill and low wage. You have to jump directly to the high skill. And you have to qualify your nationals with high skills so that they can have high wages and you can have productive and competitive jobs and so on. So I'm not sure what you are trying to say, Ishac.
Okay, no, if I could answer very quickly.
All right, Ishac, back
very
to you.
quickly, very quickly. I mean, I think we should stop saying that they're not educated. 40% of Saudis go to universities. I mean, they're totally capable of having good salaries in the private sector, in the service sector, which is needed. It's non-tradable. Replace 10 million expats by 1 million Saudis. That's my formula. Instead of getting into manufacturing things that cannot be competitive in the kingdom. That's all.
So can I just say, because I think there are two separate points here we're trying to deal with. One is there's no point for, and Saudi may not be the right economy because we're talking about large numbers of people in relative terms. But if you take a small economy like, say, Qatar, if you create an industry that is entirely staffed by expatriates to export competitively, you could argue, as you are arguing, well, what is the value added of this for the economy, especially if in fact you're subsidizing it to become competitive. That's a different point, I think, from saying, is it possible to provide jobs for nationals in a country where the number of nationals is larger? Let's take Saudi Arabia. In industries that are where their productivity is equal to the salaries that they get, and that's the question. That's the trade-off question. That's what Mustapha was saying, and I think what Nader was saying is that it's hard to imagine this being done only in the oil and gas sector. So you have to think of other sectors. Is it services? Is it manufacturing? I mean, that's the discussion to be had. I do want to get the views of the Omar and Nader on this question, since it's become one of great interest before we close. Omar, I know you have to go.
Thanks, Masood. This is an issue relevant to Jordan as well, and we've struggled with it a lot. And I fully agree with Ishaq's point and Mustapha's modification. We do need to diversify whenever it makes sense economically, but think of our own resources and our own labor structure is part of that. Jordan, for long, we have these sectors that, like the garment sector, employs foreign workers, almost all of it, and exports everything, and doesn't leave much for Jordan other than the waste produced by it. And it's in these economic zones that don't get taxed. So historically there's been a weird structure of these industries that are totally meaningless in today's. But I do agree that employment of nationals is our objective, and then we can within that we look at diversification or not, and what sort of programs we put. And I do have to apologize that I will be leaving in a couple of minutes, but I do want to listen to as much as possible.
Thank you very much, Omar. So I mean, you were saying 30% of Jordanian youth at the moment is unemployed. So the question really is, I mean, you can use whatever term you want, but where will the jobs come from, and what can you do to create the jobs that will employ them in a way that gives them the kinds of income that it reflects their productivity in those jobs? And I think that in a way that's the core issue that one is trying to grapple with. So Nader, you listen to this conversation, should we just either shut down the diversification project? What's your take on this?
Well, I think it's always a pleasure to have Ishac on these things, and because I think he might have written the concept note for this panel and put diversification in the title, and then proceeded to trash it. So it's good to do that. Diversification is, yes, it's become a catch-all word, and every country in the Gulf, and not only the Gulf, in the Middle East, has its own issues and its own takes. So let's talk about two countries that you just discussed. So Saudi Arabia is going through a profound change right now, not just socially but economically. I have been able to visit Saudi Arabia in the past 3 years, but I've been looking at the data. For the longest time, their youth unemployment among Saudi nationals has been stuck at 42%. And then it dropped to about 39%, then 36%, and I think now it's 33% if memory serves. So what's happening? A lot of stuff is happening. There's been kind of a revitalization of economic activity. A lot of expats that used to own informal businesses have been asked to close these informal businesses, and many of them have left as a result. So they've created kind of these opportunities for young Saudis to get involved in these service sectors and other activities that Ishac mentioned. So there has been an effort to kind of replace, and obviously, you know, you've heard about the work permit fee hikes to align wages of non-Saudi workers with Saudi workers more. So there's been a lot of effort essentially to focus very clearly on the issue of jobs for nationals, and it seems to be paying off. And we need to look a little bit more at what's happening to activity and output and everything else. But this is the direction that Saudi Arabia has to go. And I think it aligns perfectly with what Ishac's saying. Now, what are they doing? They're doing services. They're engaging more in tourism. Saudi Arabia is opening up in many different sectors. To me, this is diversification too. I mean, you're diversifying. Well, not really. I mean, you're actually replacing, you know, foreign nationals with nationals. But in terms of tourism, it is. In terms of other sectors, it is as well. So it's basically trying to realize that oil and gas is not going to sustain you forever unless you really develop a huge sovereign wealth fund that can basically maintain your wealth and income into the future from these resources. And this is where Qatar comes in. Qatar does have, I don't think Saudi Arabia has the luxury of being able to generate this large sovereign wealth fund that can sustain them into the future. So I'm not sure that's where maybe I disagree with Ishac. They're investing in their own white elephants. For example, NEOM, which is the initial price ticket is 500 billion. And they're continuing with it, it's gonna balloon, and it's gonna soak up the resources, and it's a huge bet, and I'm not entirely sure it's gonna pay off. Qatar does have the luxury of creating a large sovereign wealth fund, as does the UAE, which already has the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. I'm not sure if it competes with Norway, and they trade off on the top place. But for Qatar, what's interesting, it's more than economic diversification, it's really wealth and income diversification that they're after. Can they squirrel away enough of this so that they ensure that future generations are able to live sustainably off the revenues from oil and gas today? I'm not entirely sure this is the direction they're going in. Gulf countries seem to be addicted to construction, and they seem to want to build things, new cities, new parks, new other things. And you know, I mean parks. I mean like industrial complexes, industrial parks, and part of the reason is because many of the business owners, the national business owners, have construction companies, and they will continue to lobby for more construction stuff. They don't have necessarily the businesses to run these companies, many of them, once they're constructed. And this is kind of where you need to move. You need to move away in the Gulf from building things to actually running the things that have been built. And I think this is the next frontier for the Gulf, is essentially this. A lot of buildings taking place now. It's time to actually use these assets, conserve your wealth, and create. Replace some of the expat workforces, including myself and others who are here, with nationals who can do the job. So that's kind of my take.
Thank you very much, Nabli. So I see I think we're only beginning to scratch this question. And I think the one very useful takeaway from the last few minutes for me is that, the purpose of diversification is not to diversify economies for their own sake, but because it is seen as a way of providing a sustainable long-term stream of economic activity and jobs, ultimately for nationals, because that's what the responsibility of any country is, to ensure that its own nationals have sustainable, competitive future. And the question is, to what extent does that require a creation of new industries in fields other than oil and gas? Because we don't think that oil and gas will generate enough jobs and enough income in the longer term. That's the question that people are grappling with, and you can find different ways of getting at it. I do think that the model that many countries in the Gulf have followed of relying on low-skill expatriate labor to do things that in any other economy you could do with machines rather than, the more mechanized, more capital-intensive ways of doing those things is something that has to come about over time. But the question is, how can you facilitate that? So this has really been at least for me, a very fascinating and enlightening conversation. I do want to thank all of our panelists for their contributions. I do want to thank also ERF for having organized this. And I look forward to a repeat conversation, perhaps on one or other of these topics in the future. So thanks to everyone. Thanks also to all the people who participated and for the questions that you have put to the panelists.
Thank you. Thank you, Masood. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Fantastic session. Thank you.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
See you. Bye-bye.
Very good. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
This was fun.